In the hallowed halls of justice, a man's worth is supposed to be measured by the facts, not the color of his skin or the cost of his suit. But in Judge Arthur Harrington's courtroom, that ideal was about to be shattered. He looked down from his bench, a throne of polished mahogany, and saw a black man in a worn-out suit standing to defend an elderly woman against a corporate giant. The judge didn't see a citizen exercising his rights. He saw a joke. And so he laughed. A short, sharp, dismissive laugh that echoed in the silent room. What he didn't know was that he wasn't laughing at a poor, misguided man. He was laughing at a legal phantom, a genius who had walked away from the very top of the legal world and who was about to turn his courtroom into a crucible of justice and burn his entire corrupt world to the ground. The courtroom of the Honorable Judge Arthur Harrington was his kingdom. For 30 years, he had presided over Department 12 of the Franklin County Superior Court, a cavernous room of dark wood paneling and portraits of stern-faced men from a bygone era. The air itself seemed heavy-smelling of old paper floor polish and the faint metallic scent of absolute authority. Harrington, with his silver hair swept back perfectly and his black robes immaculate, saw himself not as a public servant, but as the final arbiter of a world he understood far better than the common rabble that paraded before him. On this Tuesday morning, the case was Titan Development Group versus Vance. It was on its face a simple and sad affair, the kind Harrington cleared from his docket before lunch. Titan Development, a multi-billion-dollar real estate conglomerate, had purchased an entire city block for a new luxury condominium complex. Only one tenant remained in a small rent-controlled apartment building slated for demolition. Mrs. Eleanor Vance, an 82-year-old widow who had lived there for 50 years. Titan's lawyer, Julian Croft, was everything Judge Harrington admired. Young sharp from a top-tier law firm wearing a suit that cost more than Mrs. Vance's monthly Social Security check. He laid out his case with slick, dispassionate efficiency. The eviction notices were served correctly. The relocation stipend offered was by statute generous. Mrs. Vance was legally speaking an obstacle to progress. And so Your Honor, Croft concluded, his voice smooth as silk. While Titan Development sympathizes with Mrs. Vance's situation, the law is unequivocally clear. We move for a summary judgment of eviction. Judge Harrington nodded, already formulating his ruling. He glanced over at the defendant's table. Mrs. Vance sat there, a tiny bird-like woman clutching a worn handbag, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. Next to her sat the man who had filed the papers to represent her. He was a stark contrast to Julian Croft. He was a black man, perhaps in his late 40s, with a face that seemed etched with a quiet weariness. His suit was clean but frayed at the cuffs and shiny at the elbows from years of wear. His tie was slightly askew. He looked less like a lawyer and more like someone who had wandered in off the street, perhaps a friend or a relative offering moral support. And the defense, Judge Harrington asked, his tone dripping with impatience. Mr. He squinted at the paperwork. Mr. Marcus Thorne, do you have anything to say, or are we ready to conclude this matter? Marcus Thorne rose slowly. His movements were deliberate, almost tired. When he spoke, his voice was low, but clear, filling the space without effort. Your Honor, we do have something to say. We contest the eviction on several grounds. A flicker of amusement crossed Judge Harrington's face. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his steepled fingers. Do you now, Mr. Thorne? And on what grounds would those be? Are you a member of the State Bar? I confess I don't recognize the name. This was a test, a verbal trap to establish dominance. I am representing Mrs. Vance, pro se, Your Honor, as is her right, Marcus replied calmly, neatly sidestepping the question of his credentials. Our first contention is that the initial purchase agreement for the property between Titan Development and the previous owner contains conditional clauses that were not met, potentially invalidating the sale, and by extension, this eviction. Julian Croft let out a nearly silent scoff. Judge Harrington, however, was less subtle. He laughed. It wasn't a hearty laugh, but a short, sharp bark of derision. A smirk played on his lips. Conditional clauses. Mr. Thorne, are you a real estate attorney, or did you pick that up from a late-night television show? This is a simple eviction case. The chain of title is clean. Titan Development owns the building. Let's not waste the court's time with fanciful theories. The air in the courtroom crackled. The court stenographer paused, her fingers hovering over the keys. Mrs. Vance flinched as if struck. Julian Croft grinned, sensing an easy victory. Marcus Thorne did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, a pillar of calm in the face of the court's open contempt. He met the judge's mocking gaze and held it. "With all due respect, Your Honor." Marcus said, his voice dropping a fraction, taking on a harder edge. "The law is not a matter of what you recognize, but what is written. And I assure you, I have read what is written. May I proceed with my argument? Or is the court's position that the law only applies to those who can afford expensive suits?" The silence that followed was profound. The smirk vanished from Judge Harrington's face, replaced by a flush of angry red. He had been challenged, not with aggression, but with a quiet, unshakable confidence that was more infuriating than any outburst. Judge Arthur Harrington had been publicly checked by this no-name in a threadbare suit. "Proceed, Mr. Thorne," the judge snapped, his voice cold as ice. "But be warned, I have little patience for frivolous arguments. You are walking a very fine line. The line between frivolous and genius is often only a matter of perspective." "Your Honor," Marcus replied softly. He turned to face Julian Croft, a glint in his eye that wasn't there before. "Mr. Croft, could you please provide the court with the full, unredacted purchase agreement, including all appendices and schedules for the property known as the Elm Street portfolio?" Croft looked momentarily confused. "Your Honor, that document is hundreds of pages long and contains proprietary financial information. It's not relevant. The deed is what matters." "If it's not relevant," Marcus countered smoothly, "then you should have no problem producing it. Unless, of course, there's something in those appendices that Titan Development would prefer this court not to see." Judge Harrington glared at Marcus, his mind racing. This was an unexpected tactic. It was bold, annoying, but denying a request for evidence, however broad, could be grounds for an appeal. He was trapped. "Mr. Croft produced the document," Harrington grumbled. "The court will recess for 2 hours. And Mr. Thorne," he added, pointing a finger at Marcus, "this had better be worth our time." As the judge slammed his gavel, the sharp crack echoed the one that had just appeared in his perfect, orderly world. He didn't know it yet, but the laugh he had let out moments before was the beginning of the end. He had mocked the quiet man, and now the quiet man was starting to dismantle his kingdom, one page of paper at a time. 2 hours later, the courtroom reconvened. A paralegal from Croft's firm wheeled in a dolly stacked with 3 heavy document boxes. The thud they made when placed on the defendant's table was a statement in itself, a show of force, an attempt to bury Marcus Thorne in paperwork. The message was clear. "You want the documents? Here they are. Choke on them." Julian Croft resumed his seat with a self-satisfied air. Judge Harrington looked down from his bench, his expression one of profound irritation. "Mr. Thorne, you have your mountain of paper. Now what is this supposed revelation you promised us?" Marcus paid the boxes no mind. He hadn't even opened them. Instead, he held up a single sheet of paper he'd had with him all along. It was a copy of the city's zoning map from 1972. "Your Honor, Mr. Croft." Marcus began, his voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "This isn't about what's in the purchase agreement. It's about what was required for that agreement to be legal in the first place." He walked over to an easel he had requested during the break. He tacked up the old map. With a red marker, he circled the small block where Mrs. Vance's apartment stood. In 1972, Marcus explained, in an effort to preserve community character, the City Council passed Zoning Ordinance 72C. This ordinance designated this specific block as a mixed-use community preservation zone. This meant any future sale of properties on this block was conditional upon the buyer formally pledging to maintain a certain percentage of residential units as affordable housing for a period of no less than 60 years. A murmur went through the small public gallery. Julian Croft shifted in his seat, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was searching his memory, trying to place the ordinance. It was obscure, a relic of a different era of city planning. This pledge, Marcus continued, his voice gaining momentum, was not merely a promise. It was required to be filed as a deed covenant with the county recorder's office. Without this covenant, any subsequent transfer of title is, and I quote the ordinance, contingently voidable upon challenge by an affected resident. Judge Harrington leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. A deed covenant, Mr. Thorne, if such a covenant existed, it would have been flagged during the title search. Titan Development's title insurance company would have found it. Exactly, Your Honor, Marcus said, turning to him. They would have found it. Which raises a fascinating question. Why didn't they? He then turned back to a stunned Julian Croft. Mr. Croft, did Titan Development file a new covenant when they purchased the property last year? Croft was on his feet. Your Honor, this is absurd. That ordinance is archaic. It's likely been superseded by dozens of subsequent zoning changes. It's unenforceable. Is it? Marcus's voice was sharp. The legal doctrine of laches might suggest an ordinance can become unenforceable through lack of assertion, but Ordinance 72C contains a specific perpetuity clause tying it directly to the property, not its owners. It has never been legally repealed or superseded. Has it, Mr. Croft? I'm sure a lawyer of your caliber would have checked. Croft was speechless. He hadn't checked. No one would have. It was a ghost ordinance, a footnote in the city's vast legal history. It was brilliant. It was also, he suspected, a dead end. Even if this phantom covenant were an issue, Croft stammered, recovering it would be a matter between Titan and the city, or perhaps the seller. It has no bearing on a simple, unlawful detainer action against a tenant. On the contrary, Marcus countered, moving in for the kill. It has every bearing. Mrs. Vance is an affected resident, the very class of person the ordinance was designed to protect. Her tenancy is the embodiment of the affordable housing requirement. Therefore, she has legal standing to challenge the validity of the sale itself. If the sale is voidable, Titan Development has no legal standing as her landlord. And if they are not her landlord, they cannot evict her. Their entire case rests on a foundation of ownership that the law itself deems unstable. The courtroom was silent. This was no longer a simple eviction. It was a masterful dissection of property law, a legal deep dive that no one, least of all the judge, had seen coming. In the back, a young court clerk named Sarah Jenkins was typing furiously into her computer, not transcribing the proceedings, but searching the court's internal database. She was intrigued by this Marcus Thorne. His name yielded no active bar license in the state, no disciplinary actions, no public records of any recent cases. It was as if he didn't exist in the legal world. Yet he was currently running circles around one of the city's top corporate attorneys. Judge Harrington stared down at Marcus, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. The initial contempt had been replaced by a grudging, infuriated respect. This wasn't some street corner lawyer. This man knew the law perhaps better than Harrington himself, but admitting that was impossible. A novel theory, Mr. Thorne, the judge said, his voice tight. But a theory is all it is. You have no proof that this covenant was never filed. You are correct, Your Honor. I don't, Marcus conceded, causing Julian Croft to sigh in relief. But I don't need to. The burden of proof is on the plaintiff. It is up to Titan Development to prove they hold a clear, unassailable title. I have just introduced reasonable doubt that they do. Therefore, their motion for summary judgment must fail. He paused, letting the logic settle in the room. Then he went further. But since we are on the subject of proof, Marcus said, finally turning to the 3 boxes of documents. He didn't open them. He simply rested his hand on the top box. I would like to direct the court's attention to Appendix G of the purchase agreement, the section on financial indemnifications. I'm sure Mr. Croft is familiar with it. Croft's eyes widened slightly. He knew Appendix G. It was boilerplate, a standard section where the seller indemnifies the buyer against any unforeseen liabilities. Specifically, Marcus continued, his voice low and dangerous. I'm interested in the indemnity cap. Usually it's a percentage of the purchase price, but for the Elm Street portfolio, the seller, a small family-owned LLC, agreed to an unlimited indemnity clause. They exposed themselves to potentially limitless financial liability. Why would such a small company agree to such a catastrophic risk? What liability were they so desperate to offload that they would agree to a clause no sane lawyer would ever advise them to sign? Marcus leaned in, his gaze fixed on Julian Croft. It seems to me that the seller knew all about Ordinance 72C. They knew the title was poisoned, and they found a buyer who for some reason didn't seem to care. The trap had been sprung. Marcus hadn't needed to find the missing covenant. He had used Titan's own paperwork to prove that they likely knew it was missing all along. They had bought a flawed property, and he had just exposed the flaw. Judge Harrington slammed his gavel. "This court will take a 24-hour recess to review these allegations," he snarled. He looked from the document boxes to Marcus Thorne, a man who had transformed from a joke into a serious threat. "Mr. Thorne, you will be in my chambers tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. sharp. With your bar card." The threat was clear, but as Marcus Thorne gathered his papers, he didn't look worried. He simply gave a small, reassuring nod to Mrs. Vance. The ghost had left his calling card, and the haunting of Judge Harrington's courtroom had only just begun. Judge Harrington's chambers were a reflection of the man himself, opulent, orderly, and reeking of self-importance. A massive oak desk dominated the room, its surface clear save for a leather-bound blotter and a single family photo. The walls were lined with books that looked as if they had never been opened, and plaques celebrating his long career. Marcus Thorne stood before the desk the next morning, holding nothing but a worn leather portfolio. Judge Harrington sat behind the desk, his face like a thundercloud. Julian Croft stood off to the side, looking pale and sleep-deprived. He'd spent the night with his team tearing through city archives, and they had confirmed it. Ordinance 72C was real unrepealed, and the required covenant for the Elm Street portfolio was indeed missing from the county records. Mr. Thorne, the judge began dispensing with any pretense of courtesy. "You have caused a great deal of trouble. You have made a serious accusation implying corporate malfeasance, and you have done so while failing to identify yourself as a member of the bar. I asked you to be here to present your credentials. So present them, or I will hold you in contempt of this court and have you jailed." Marcus placed his portfolio on the desk but did not open it. "Your Honor, my ability to practice law is not the most pressing issue here. The pressing issue is that Titan Development knowingly purchased a property with a clouded title and attempted to use this court to illegally evict an 82-year-old woman. That is a baseless allegation." Croft interjected, his voice strained. "We relied on our title insurance. This is at worst a clerical error from 50 years ago." Marcus turned his calm, unblinking gaze on Croft. "A clerical error? Then please explain the unlimited indemnity clause. Explain why your client was willing to absorb a risk that could bankrupt them if, for instance, a class action lawsuit were brought by all the former tenants who were illegally displaced from that block over the years. That's a liability that could run into the hundreds of millions." Croft paled further. The implications were staggering. "That's enough," Harrington boomed, slamming his hand on the desk. "I am the one asking the questions here, Mr. Thorne." "Who are you?" Marcus sighed softly, a sound of profound disappointment. It was as if he had hoped to avoid this part. He finally opened the portfolio. He slid a single laminated card across the polished oak. Judge Harrington picked it up. It was a State Bar of New York card. The name read Marcus T. Thorne. The ID number was low, indicating long-standing membership. It was valid. But that wasn't what made the judge's blood run cold. It was the name itself. Thorne. Marcus Thorne. A name he hadn't heard in 15 years, a name that was once whispered with a mixture of awe and fear in the highest echelons of corporate law. Thorne. Harrington breathed, looking up at the man before him. The worn suit, the tired eyes. It was all a disguise, a perfect camouflage. "They called you the ghost of Harvard Law." Julian Croft's head snapped up. His jaw went slack. Every top-tier lawyer knew the legend. Marcus Thorne had been the undisputed prodigy of his generation. Editor of the Harvard Law Review, clerk for a Supreme Court justice, and then the youngest partner in the history of the legendary New York firm Cravath, Swaine, and Moore. He was an artist in the courtroom, known for seeing angles no one else saw, for finding the single loose thread that could unravel the most complex case. And then 15 years ago, at the absolute peak of his career, after winning a landmark case against a pharmaceutical giant, he had vanished. He cashed out, resigned his partnership, and simply disappeared from the legal world. You're that Marcus Thorne," Croft whispered, his voice full of disbelief and a dawning horror. He wasn't being beaten by some pro-C amateur. He was being dismantled by a master. "I was," Marcus said quietly. "I grew tired of helping corporations like Titan find clever ways to bend the rules. I decided the law might be better used to help people like Mrs. Vance. Judge Harrington stared at the bar card, then at Marcus. The derision was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating fear. A man like Thorne didn't come out of retirement for a simple eviction case. He didn't unearth a 50-year-old ordinance by accident. This wasn't a random act of charity. This was a hunt, and Harrington was suddenly terrified that he was the prey. Your point about the covenant is noted. Harrington said, his tone now dramatically different. It was the voice of a man speaking to an equal, or perhaps a superior. Mr. Croft, your client's motion for summary judgment is denied. This court will schedule a full hearing on the matter of the title's validity. It was a total victory for Marcus, but he wasn't finished. There is one more thing, Your Honor, Marcus said, his voice dropping again, becoming conspiratorial. The question I raised yesterday, why would Titan Development be so confident in purchasing a property with such a significant known flaw in its title? He let the question hang in the air. Perhaps, Marcus continued, they believed any legal challenges that arose would be favorably adjudicated. Perhaps they had an assurance that any judge presiding over the case would see things their way, regardless of obscure ordinances or missing covenants. The accusation was no longer aimed at Croft or Titan. It was pointed directly at the man behind the desk. Harrington shot to his feet. That is an outrageous and slanderous implication. You are on the verge of being sanctioned, Mr. Thorne, legend or not. Am I? Marcus replied, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the judge's fury. Let's go back to those boxes of documents you were so dismissive of. Titan's financial disclosures. I had a long night. I did more than just look at the indemnity clause. I looked at their list of shell corporations and subsidiary LLCs. It's standard practice to obscure asset ownership. He pulled another paper from his portfolio. It was a flow chart he had sketched on a legal pad. Titan Development owns a subsidiary called Apex Holdings. Apex Holdings is the sole investor in a company called North Star Ventures. And North Star Ventures, a company with no employees and no physical office, made a single very large investment last year. It purchased a controlling interest in a small private equity fund called the Ridgeway Capital Fund. Judge Harrington's face had gone from red to a ghastly ashen white. He looked like he was about to have a heart attack. He recognized the name, the Ridgeway Capital Fund. Marcus said, his voice like a hammer striking an anvil, is managed by a firm in Delaware. It's also, by sheer coincidence, the primary investment vehicle for a certain blind trust. A blind trust set up 30 years ago to manage the personal assets of a newly appointed state judge. Marcus took a step closer to the desk, his eyes locked on Harrington's. Your blind trust, Judge Harrington. The room was utterly silent, save for the judge's ragged breathing. The trap was no longer about a real estate deal. The eviction of Mrs. Vance had been the key, the small, rusty lock that Marcus Thorne had expertly picked, and the door it had opened led straight into the judge's own meticulously concealed corruption. You've been taking kickbacks, Marcus stated, not as a question, but as a fact. Titan Development didn't need to worry about the poison title because they had already bought the judge. They funneled money through 3 layers of corporate misdirection right into your retirement fund. In exchange, you would guarantee their legal victories in your courtroom. How many other cases, I wonder? How many other people like Mrs. Vance have you thrown out on the street to protect your investment? Julian Croft looked back and forth between the legendary lawyer and the crumbling judge. He backed away slowly, as if trying to distance himself from the impending explosion. He was just a lawyer. He had no idea the scheme ran this deep. He had been a pawn in a much larger, dirtier game. Judge Harrington sank into his chair, his hands trembling. The authority, the arrogance, the entire facade he had built over 30 years had just been demolished in under 5 minutes by a man he had laughed at. This is insane, Harrington stammered, but the words had no conviction. You have no proof. Proof? Marcus gave a small, sad smile. Judge, I don't need it. I'm not a prosecutor. I'm just a lawyer for a little old lady. All I have to do is submit this flowchart as evidence in my motion to have you recuse yourself from this case for extreme judicial misconduct and a clear conflict of interest. I'll file it publicly. The U.S. Attorney's Office can handle the rest. They are so much better at finding proof than I am. He laid the flowchart gently on the desk on top of his New York bar card. It was a checkmate. The ghost had not only come back to haunt the system, he had come back to cleanse it with fire. And Judge Arthur Harrington was about to be the first to burn. The motion for recusal filed by Marcus Thorne an hour later landed on the desk of the presiding judge of the Franklin County Superior Court like a lit stick of dynamite. It wasn't just a motion, it was a bombshell, a meticulously crafted narrative of corruption, complete with the damning flowchart connecting Titan development directly to Judge Harrington's personal finances. News travels fast in a courthouse. By noon, the rumor mill was churning at full capacity. Clerks whispered by the coffee machine. Lawyers huddled in the hallways, speaking in hushed tones. The name Marcus Thorne, once a forgotten legend, was now on everyone's lips. The story of the shabby-looking lawyer who had stood up to King Harrington was already becoming myth. Sarah Jenkins, the young court clerk, watched the chaos unfold with a sense of awe. She had been the one to notice something was different about Marcus. Driven by a hunch after the first day in court, she had used her after-hours access to run a deep dive on Judge Harrington's case history. What she found sickened her. Over the past decade, Harrington had presided over 6 major cases involving Titan Development or its known subsidiaries. In every single one, he had ruled decisively in their favor, often through summary judgments that shut down arguments before they could even be properly made. The pattern was undeniable. Armed with this information, she had made a choice. Late last night, she had found the public access hotel where Marcus was staying, a modest, clean place far from the luxury hotels frequented by lawyers like Croft. She slipped a manila envelope under his door. It contained a simple anonymous printout of the case numbers and their outcomes. She didn't know if he would use it or even if he needed it. She just knew she had to do something. Now, seeing the fallout, she felt a terrifying mix of vindication and fear. She had taken on the system from within a small cog turning against the machine. Meanwhile, in the eye of the storm, Judge Harrington was imploding. He had locked himself in his chambers, refusing to speak to anyone. His kingdom was crumbling, his 30-year reign of carefully cultivated power and illicit wealth exposed by a man he had dismissed with a laugh. The irony was a bitter poison. His first call was not to a lawyer, but to his contact at Titan Development, a senior vice president named Robert Sterling. The conversation was short and brutal. "What the hell happened?" Arthur Sterling's voice was ice. "My legal team is in a panic. They're talking about a ghost from New York. They're saying you've been exposed." Thorne Harrington rasped, his voice hoarse. "Marcus Thorne is representing the old woman. He found everything." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Sterling was a pragmatist. He knew when a ship was sinking. "This conversation never happened, Arthur. Titan Development has no knowledge of your personal financial arrangements. You are on your own." The line went dead. The betrayal was swift and absolute. He was being cut loose, thrown to the wolves to save the corporation. His career was over. His freedom was in jeopardy. His entire life was a house of cards, and Marcus Thorne had just pulled out the one card that made it all stand up. Across town, Marcus was sitting with Eleanor Vance in her small sunlit apartment. It was filled with old photographs, potted plants, and the smell of lavender. She had made him a cup of tea, her hand still trembling slightly. "I don't understand all the things you said in there, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice soft. "All that talk about corporations and funds. But I understand that you saved me." Marcus looked around the apartment at the 50 years of memories contained within its walls. This was why he had come back. Not for the thrill of the fight, not for the intellectual challenge, but for this, for the simple, profound act of defending a home. "The fight isn't over yet, Mrs. Vance," he said gently, "but we've won the most important battle. They cannot throw you out. Your home is safe." Tears welled in her eyes. "My husband, George, he always said, 'Do right by people and the world will do right by you.' I was starting to believe he was wrong. Thank you for showing me he wasn't." At that moment, Marcus's cheap burner phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. It contained only a street address and a time. An invitation. He knew who it was from. Later that evening, Marcus walked into a quiet, old-fashioned bar in the city's financial district. In a dark booth at the back, Julian Croft was waiting. The arrogant, slick lawyer from the courtroom was gone. In his place was a humbled, visibly shaken man. Thorne Croft said, gesturing to the seat opposite him. "Thanks for coming. I'm not here to socialize," Croft Marcus said, remaining standing. "I know," Croft said, looking down at his drink. "I'm out. I tendered my resignation this afternoon. My firm, they're already in damage control. They're preparing to cooperate fully with the U.S. Attorney's Office in exchange for leniency. They'll give them everything on Titan." He looked up at Marcus. "I was a tool. A well-paid, arrogant fool, but a tool nonetheless. I never knew about the payments to Harrington. I swear on my career what's left of it." Marcus studied his face, seeing the genuine remorse and fear there. "Ignorance is not a defense, Croft. It's just a privilege you could afford." "I know," Croft admitted. "Look, that's not why I asked you here. I'm going to have to testify. I'll be disbarred, most likely. I've accepted that. But before that happens, I wanted to give you this." He slid a flash drive across the table. "Titan is already shredding documents, electronically and physically, but I have a full unredacted archive of their internal audits for the last 5 years. Everything. The real books, not the ones they show the SEC. It proves the payments to Harrington were just the tip of the iceberg. They have judges on the payroll in 3 other states. It's a nationwide conspiracy of bribery. It's a machine." Marcus picked up the flash drive. This was more than he could have hoped for. He had come to slay a dragon in one courtroom, but Croft had just handed him the map to the entire lair. "Why?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious. "Why give this to me?" Croft let out a bitter laugh. "Because you beat me. No, you annihilated me. You did it for an old woman and a cup of tea while I did it for a 7-figure salary. It makes a man reevaluate his choices." He paused, then added, "And maybe it's a down payment on whatever soul I have left." Marcus pocketed the drive. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Good luck, Croft." As he walked out of the bar and into the cool night air, Marcus Thorne knew the case of Titan v. Vance was over. But the war against the machine, the vast corrupt system that put profit before people, had just found its new general. The ghost was no longer just a memory. He was a force of nature, and he was about to unleash a storm. The wheels of justice, once nudged in the right direction, can move with astonishing speed and force. The flash drive Julian Croft provided was the key that unlocked everything. Marcus, working through the night with a level of focus that had once terrified entire legal departments, collated the data. He built an irrefutable timeline of bribes, corrupt rulings, and perjured testimonies that spanned nearly a decade and implicated not just Judge Harrington, but 2 other sitting judges and a powerful state senator. He didn't leak it to the press. That would have been messy and sensational. Marcus Thorne was a surgeon. He made his incision directly at the heart of the matter. He delivered the package via a trusted courier to the desk of the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District, a woman known for her iron will and intolerance for public corruption. The result was a quiet, coordinated, and utterly devastating takedown. 1 week after he had laughed in his courtroom, federal agents arrived at Judge Arthur Harrington's stately home in the suburbs. They didn't come with sirens blaring. They came in quiet sedans wearing professional suits on a gray, drizzling morning. They presented him with an arrest warrant as he was collecting his newspaper from the front step. The charges were racketeering, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and money laundering. The man who had wielded a gavel, like a scepter, was quietly handcuffed, the metallic click of the cuffs, a final, damning judgment. There were no cameras, but the image of his humiliation would be seared into the minds of everyone in the legal community. The karma was swift and brutal. His assets, including the blind trust, were frozen. His prestigious club memberships were revoked. The family whose picture sat on his desk disowned him, his wife filing for divorce within a month, citing the public disgrace. The plaques on his wall were rendered meaningless. He had built his life on a foundation of perceived honor and secret greed, and when the secrets came out, the honor evaporated, leaving nothing behind. Simultaneously, federal agents raided the corporate headquarters of Titan Development. Robert Sterling, the vice president, who had so coldly cut Harrington loose, was arrested in the middle of a board meeting. The company's stock plummeted over 60% in a single day of trading, wiping out billions in shareholder value. The corporation, once a titan of industry, was brought to its knees, facing federal indictments that would likely see it dismantled and sold for parts. The other corrupt judges and the state senator were arrested in similar fashion, a systemic cancer cut out in a single precise operation. The story finally broke, and it was a national scandal. but the hero of the story remained elusive. News reports mentioned a tip from a confidential informant and the actions of a disgraced former attorney, Julian Croft, who was now the government's star witness. The name Marcus Thorne was never mentioned. The ghost remained a ghost. For Marcus, the victory was not in the headlines. It was in the quiet resolution of Mrs. Vance's life. Tightened development under new court-appointed leadership not only dropped the eviction suit, but in a move of profound public penance, they gifted the entire apartment building to a newly formed community land trust. The residents, including Mrs. Vance, would be able to live there secure in their homes for the rest of their lives. Marcus handled the legal transfer himself. On the day the deed was signed, there was a small gathering in the building's modest lobby. Mrs. Vance, holding the new deed in her hands, hugged Marcus with a strength that belied her age. "You didn't just give me my home back, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave all of us our dignity." As he was leaving, he was approached by Sarah Jenkins, the court clerk. She looked nervous but determined. "Mr. Thorne," she began, I was the one who slipped the file under your door, with Harrington's case history." Marcus stopped and looked at her. He gave her a small, genuine smile. "I know, and it was the piece I was missing to confirm the pattern. You were very brave, Sarah. You took a great risk." "It felt like the right thing to do," she said, blushing slightly. "What you did, it reminded me why I wanted to work in law in the first place. I've applied to law school. My acceptance letter came yesterday." Marcus's smile widened. "That's the best news I've heard all week. The world needs more lawyers like you and fewer like I used to be." He was about to walk away when she asked the question that hung in the air. "Will you go back to the big firms? They'd be lining up to hire you now. You could have anything you want." Marcus looked back at the apartment building, at the faces of the people he had helped, people whose lives would have been destroyed without a second thought by men like Harrington and Sterling. "I already have everything I want," he said, and with that he walked away, disappearing into the city streets, his worn suit blending into the crowd, a phantom of justice once more. The hard karma had hit back not like a wild, chaotic storm, but like a perfectly weighted hammer, striking with precision and shattering a corrupt world. Judge Harrington, sitting in a sterile federal detention cell, would have the rest of his life to reflect on his mistake. He would remember the polished wood of his courtroom, the feeling of absolute power, and the moment he looked down at a quiet black man and laughed a laugh that cost him everything. 6 months later, the aftershocks of the scandal had subsided, leaving a landscape of ruin and renewal in their wake. For Arthur Harrington, the world had shrunk to the size of an 8 by 10-foot federal detention cell. Stripped of his judicial robes, his reputation, and his freedom, he was no longer a king in a kingdom of mahogany and leather, but simply inmate Nasher 734. In a desperate bid to avoid the public spectacle of a trial that would air every sordid detail of his corruption, he accepted a plea bargain. The sentence, 12 years in a minimum security prison, was a hammer blow, but the true punishment was the deafening silence from a world that had once revered him. His name, once a symbol of authority, was physically chiseled from the marble wall of the courthouse, an act of erasure that finalized his fall from grace. He became a ghost of a different kind, a cautionary tale whispered by young associates, a lesson in how swiftly a legacy built on lies can turn to dust. The corporate behemoth he served fared no better. Titan Development Group, once an unshakable pillar of the financial world, imploded with spectacular velocity. The flash drive from Julian Croft had been a master key unlocking a Pandora's box of systemic fraud. Shareholder lawsuits piled up like snowdrifts in a blizzard. Federal investigators swarmed their headquarters, carting away servers and shredding the last vestiges of the company's credibility. The board, in a panic, fired hundreds in a futile attempt to cauterize the wound, but the rot was too deep. Eventually, the once mighty corporation was broken apart by court order, its assets auctioned off like spoils of war. Its iconic skyscraper was sold to a competitor, its logo pried from the granite facade, leaving a faint outline, the ghost of a fallen giant. Julian Croft, the catalyst for this corporate demolition, walked a narrow path of atonement. His testimony was the government's centerpiece, a clear, damning account of the rot he had willingly served. Facing his former superiors in court, He spoke with a quiet, hollowed-out conviction. The experience cost him his career, his license, and his standing, but in return it gave him something he didn't know he'd lost. Spared prison time for his cooperation, he disappeared from the high-powered legal world. Months later, he resurfaced as a salaried paralegal at a small immigration law clinic. He traded his $1,000 suits for department store shirts and his corner office for a cubicle, finding a strange, humbling peace in helping families navigate a system he had once so expertly manipulated for profit. The scandal's most enduring legacy, however, was the reformation it forced upon the Franklin County judiciary. The Harrington affair became a synonym for systemic failure, prompting the state to establish the Judicial Integrity and Oversight Committee, a watchdog with real teeth. A new culture of transparency born of fear and necessity began to permeate the courthouse halls. The machine Marcus had fought wasn't entirely destroyed, but it was wounded, exposed, and forced to evolve. Amidst this sweeping change, Marcus Thorne made a quiet choice. The path back to New York to a seven-figure salary and a life of celebrated luxury was wide open. Recruiters left him voicemails laden with promises, but he never returned their calls. The emptiness of that life was a taste he could still remember. Instead, he cashed in a single modest investment portfolio from his past, a relic from the ghost of Cravath, Swain and Moore, and planted a seed in the community he had come to defend. 2 blocks from Mrs. Vance's apartment, he bought a derelict storefront, a place with cracked windows and faded paint. He didn't hire an expensive firm. He hired local contractors overseeing the work himself. Slowly, the space transformed. The grime was washed away, the windows replaced. Fresh paint covered the scars of neglect. When it was finished, a simple hand-painted sign appeared in the window: Elm Street Community Law Center, legal help for those who need it. His first official act was offering a job to Sarah Jenkins. He found her studying in the local library, buried in tort law textbooks. He offered her the position of lead paralegal and office manager, a role that would allow her to earn a living while attending her night classes. She accepted with tears in her eyes, seeing a chance to be part of the change she had helped ignite. They were soon joined by 2 other young lawyers, bright minds who had turned down lucrative corporate offers, drawn by the legend of the quiet man and the chance to practice law as a service, not a business. Their work was the unglamorous, essential bedrock of justice. They fought for tenants facing retaliatory evictions, for construction workers denied pay, for families tangled in the merciless red tape of social services. Each case was small, but to the person sitting across the desk, it was the whole world. One crisp autumn afternoon, Marcus was hunched over a file, mapping out a strategy to fight a disability benefits denial for a child with a rare genetic disorder. It was a maddening case of bureaucratic indifference, the exact kind of soul-crushing injustice that made his blood boil and his mind focus with crystalline clarity. Sarah entered and placed a steaming mug of coffee on his desk. "You're going to burn a hole through that table if you keep staring at it like that," she said with a gentle smile. "I'm just finding the weak point in their argument." He murmured, a hint of the old hunter in his voice. "Well, take a break," she insisted. "Mrs. Vance dropped off a pie, apple crumb. She left specific instructions that you were to get the first and biggest slice." Marcus finally looked up from the documents. His gaze drifted past Sarah out the large window of their office. He saw the vibrant life of the street kids walking home from school, neighbors chatting on a stoop, the familiar rhythm of a community that felt whole. He had once commanded boardrooms and mesmerized federal judges, earning fees that could buy anything except the one thing he craved: a sense of purpose. Here in this small office, with a pro bono case as his challenge and the promise of a homemade pie as his reward, he felt a profound sense of wealth that money could never touch. He had not just won a case, he had found a calling. The judge's derisive laugh had been the sound of a system breaking. The quiet hum of this small law center was the sound of something new, something better being built in its place. The story of Marcus Thorne and Judge Harrington is a powerful reminder that justice isn't always found in the grandest courtrooms or dispensed by the most powerful people. Sometimes it's forged in the quiet courage of one individual willing to stand up against contempt and corruption. Marcus Thorne, a man who had the world at his feet, walked away from it all only to find true purpose in defending one elderly woman. In doing so, he didn't just save her home. He exposed a rot that ran to the very heart of the system and in the process found his own soul. This story shows us that a single act of defiance rooted in principle and backed by brilliance can cause an entire corrupt structure to collapse. It begs the question, what injustices do we walk past every day? What Goliaths do we allow to intimidate the Davids among us? If this story of karma and ultimate justice moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And for more true-to-life stories of forgotten heroes and justice served, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. Let us know in the comments below, what part of Marcus's strategy impressed you the most? We love hearing from you. Thank you for listening.